Hello, everybody. The webinar will begin very shortly. We're just going to take a few moments to let everybody join the call. So, good afternoon from a rather wintry, snowy London here today. But I think a lot of you who are joining us, it's probably morning where you are. So, good morning. Welcome to our webinar today, where we're going to be looking at how the federal government is getting ready for the new president. I'm Siobhan Benita. I'm a former UK senior civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing this conversation on behalf of Global Government Forum, which is a publishing house, and we serve civil servants, public servants all around the world. We have two fantastic experts with us here today, and I'll be introducing them in a moment and then getting the conversation going. But in terms of the topic today and what we'll be looking at, I think it's safe to say that in this what's been called the year of democracy, when over half of the world's population has been voting in their national elections, the US presidential election has been the most closely watched and is potentially the most consequential. And now that we know the results of that election, I think attention is turning to what does this mean? So, including how is the federal government going to be getting ready to support their new president? And the kind of areas we'll be covering today, we'll be looking at what the election result reveals about the public's priorities for the government, how the result fits into international trends in elections, what happens in a government transition, how the civil servants are preparing for implementing President Trump's priorities, and some of the key appointments we'll be covering that have already been made so far, and looking at what those indicate in terms of the new president's policy priorities. As I said, I'm going to introduce our two experts and then I'm going to ask them a couple of questions to get the conversation going. But I want to stress from the start, we would like this to be a conversation with you, our audience. So I will be taking questions and comments from you throughout the discussion. So please don't wait till the end. Whichever device you are using, you should see a Q&A button somewhere on that device. Please use that Q&A button to message in your questions and your comments at any point from now on, and we will get to those through as many of those as we can before the end of today's conversation. But in terms of our two fantastic experts here today, we've got Jason Breifel, who is a non-attorney partner and Director of Government and Public Affairs at the boutique federal practice law firm Shaw, Bransford and Roth, which is based in Washington, D.C. And Jason provides legislative and organizational representation to clients of the firm's government affairs practice. He's frequently quoted in the media and is a regular speaker at training events, conferences, and other government-focused events. And Jason also serves as editor-in-chief of the Fed Manager and Fed Agent newsletters, and is also a co-host of the firm's podcast, Fed Talks. So it's great to have you here with us today, Jason.
Glad to
Then
be
we
here.
all Brilliant. Then we also have Richard Johnston, who is the executive editor of Global Government Forum, where Richard helps to produce the editorial analysis and insight for the title's audience of public servants all around the world. And before joining GGF, he spent nearly 5 years at the UK-based title Civil Service World, latterly as acting editor, and he's worked in public policy journalism throughout his career. So as I say, please do get your questions sent in as soon as possible. If anything piques your interest while our speakers are talking, send in your questions then and I'll come to them straight away. So my first question to kick us off, I'm going to come to you, Jason, and going back to what I said we would be covering. So a very simple question really for you is, what did the election result reveal about the American public's priorities for their next government?
Absolutely. And thanks again for having me here. I think that the public wanted change. First and foremost, I think that this is an election about change. and the public feeling that the government wasn't meeting their priorities. I think that the first issue is pocketbook issues. The impacts of COVID and then inflation coming out of that, just the price of food, healthcare, and others really were a drag on the American people. And the Biden administration wasn't able to sell the story about the work that they did to address that challenge. And then I do think that immigration was another related issue. It certainly drove certain voters. It certainly helped propel President Trump and Republicans to a majority across the country. And as you all in your audience might know, this is an area that we have talked about in America for a long time, but our Congress hasn't been able to come to an agreement on. And President Trump promised to take action. And I think that that's another area that folks responded to in the election.
Thanks, Jason. So, Richard, I'm going to come to you. So, what Jason's saying there, I think that sense that what the Biden government, whatever they were doing, all the efforts weren't actually improving people's lives. They were still feeling that real cost of living crisis, which I think is familiar around the world at the moment. And then immigration, again, another theme that we've seen throughout the world. So, do you think the US results fit with electoral trends that we've seen in other countries?
Yeah, it fits very well into a quite remarkable trend we've seen this year. Hello, everyone, and great to have you on board. As you mentioned, Siobhan, it's a year of democracy. And the remarkable stat is that in every one of the 10 major democracies that have held elections this year, national elections, the incumbent party has lost vote share in every one. It's the first time that's ever happened. Now, there's quite a lot of caveats to that, obviously, an incumbent party losing vote share, but for all the years that we have had democracy, that's the first time that's happened, and that's quite, I think, a remarkable statistic. The Democrats' performance was actually among the best of the incumbents, which will be of little solace to them. But the Democrats lost approximately, I know the vote count's not quite finished yet, 3.7%. I think it was the statistic I saw from the research project that tracks this called ParlGov. So that was the second best performance by an incumbent party in the elections this year. Only the coalition government in Belgium lost less vote share. And at the other end of the scale, I think the worst performance was the UK Conservative Party in the election that we had, where they lost 19.9% of their vote. Whereas in France, the election that President Macron called to try to bring to a head the political growth of the National Assembly Party, Macron's grouping lost 4.7% of its vote. So it is quite remarkable that trend has been replicated across all of the developed world, and I think Jason touched on some of the points there that were major drivers in the US election campaign, but I think you can draw them globally as well. These results come at a time of high inflation, higher than many people have experienced for decades, and high salience of migration as an issue. And I think those are the two kind of major trends that have contributed to this kind of global decline in support for incumbent governments.
Brilliant, thanks. We might come back to some of those policy areas as we continue our conversation. But I know, so as I said, I think we've got lots of people from America and Canada probably in the audience, but we do have a global audience with us here today. So Jason, for the purposes of everybody that's watching, could you just explain a little bit about what happens now in terms of this transition? So what's the kind of process and why is it like that in America?
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, we might have folks who aren't familiar with the American government. So to level set, we had an election at the same time for members of Congress, our elected officials, and the president. And so they're going to be coming into office at approximately the same time. Congress around January 3rd, and then the president taking office on January 20th at noon. And There is a layer of political leaders and political appointees in the U.S. federal government that change over in between administrations. There are about 4,000 of those individuals in a workforce of about 2.1 million civil servants. And so there are 4,000 individuals who come and go at the end of an administration. And what you're hearing now is picks from President-elect Trump and his team for some of his senior leaders, cabinet level officials. These are going to be folks who require confirmation in the United States Senate. They have a constitutional role to engage in provide advice and consent for the president's nominees, basically checking to make sure that they feel that they're qualified and can do a good job and shouldn't be put in those positions of responsibility. There are 1,300 of those positions in the U.S. government that require Senate action. One of the challenges over time, it's taken upwards of almost 200 days to get people confirmed. Congress usually is pretty good about those principal officers, those cabinet leaders, but getting in the lower level folks, the deputies and what have you, has been really challenging and has vexed presidents of both parties for a long time. Presidents get an additional about 1,000 presidential appointees. So these might be agency heads who don't require Senate confirmation and other officials, boards and commissions. And then there's another 2,000 or so confidential assistants, people doing policy work, but they are political appointees working for the administration. And so as you can imagine, 4,000 people, getting them in, getting them vetted, getting them placed into their jobs while the agency is still operating under the leadership of career civil servants, working with the handful of appointees who might be in, is part of the process that's going on. Congress first passed a law in the early 1960s, codifying a presidential transition and requirements, and over time has continued to build upon that to put process in place so that incoming administrations can be prepared. They have access to information technology resources. They're doing background checks of their appointees that need them. They're getting cybersecurity services. They have physical access, office space, and the ability to go into federal agencies. One thing that I will mention, the last thing I'd say, is that we know that President-elect Trump's transition team is still negotiating with the current administration those agreements. And until those agreements are signed, Trump transition officials cannot go into federal agencies to start collecting information in the transition period. So that's definitely something that we'll be watching for. And I'll drop in the link, an article from Axios from a few days ago, but this is an important linchpin in the process.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jason. So lots going on, lots determined by legislation, the process actually in place. And I'm going to come on in a minute to questions about what civil servants themselves will be doing to prepare for the new president. And then, Richard, I'm going to ask you, because this is very different to other countries, I think certainly very different to what we have here in the UK. But before we just come on, I want to park those questions a minute, because I did say we'd take questions as they come in. And I don't want to lose this one from Heidi, because this goes back to what you both were just saying about the election result. And Heidi, I don't know where Heidi's from, but Heidi has said, for the election result, how much do you think it was due to the electorate mistakenly, I mean, maybe that gives away some of Heidi's thinking on this, but connecting economy to the president, and how much was it due to being affected by conservative media stoking anger? I think you could broaden this question. So how much do you think the economy, the reality of the economy drove what people voted for, against how much maybe a media narrative influenced what they voted for? Jason, you're nodding, and then I'll see, Richard,
Sure.
if you want to.
Reality is only what people believe, isn't it? And I do think that, at a more macro level, the information environment that we are living in is wild, and people can pick and choose where they get information. You have blue news, you have red news, you have things all across the spectrum, and increasingly people are getting information from those corners that they choose and they affiliate with. And I do think that that is an issue to deal with in democratic and civil society. I don't have the answers for that, but I can say that I would imagine that the ability of President-elect Trump to turn out low propensity voters probably is tied by seeing more information. People were seeing stuff about the election, and they were motivated to vote.
Thanks, Jason. And just say Heidi has said she's in the civil service in Washington, DC, so she's from Washington. Richard, did you want to add anything? I know Global Government Forum, we have just recently done a report on making government work. So what makes a government effective in the modern times? And this challenge of information, so much information and also so much misinformation is one of the issues that came out.
Yeah, and trust in government and the information that government produces is very important, and it was an issue that came up, as you mentioned, in the Making Government Works report. I would say, as an outsider, I think there's very close relationship in kind of in American culture between kind of political valence and perception of the economy. I did see some polling that that said that people who voted for Trump already think the economy is better than it was. Because, so it seemed that seems
Pretty
to
amazing,
me.
isn't it? He's not
I'm
even
not. I'm not a political scientist, but that seems to me like there might be some perceptions of the economy might be downstream of political leanings. But I think I also think that there was a stream of commentary in the build up to the election that was trying to say that the US economy is fine, actually, and that people's concerns about that were overblown. But as Jason said, perception is reality. If people think the economy isn't doing well, that is what they're going to base their vote on.
Thanks, Richard. Jason Churchill, who's asking a question. I'm not ignoring your questions. It's just they are going to be very relevant for the next section as we come to the next section. But I will take Lisa's question because that's relevant to what you've just talked about, Jason, in terms of the transition process. So Lisa has said, could Richard or Jason share your views on whether the standard Senate process on advice and consent will be followed, or rather, is the likely scenario that there will be recess appointments and people placed in long-term acting positions? I think this goes back to Jason, you saying all of these appointments need to be made. Do you think that due process will be followed?
So I think lots of things will happen, and it's impossible to speculate. Like, will the Senate uphold their constitutional prerogative as a body, and will the Senate Republican majority as a majority decide that? I don't know. I sure hope so. I know that there are certain longstanding members who will, but they can lose 4 votes, and the vice president can tie break to put appointees in. Part of this is a loyalty test, as President-elect Trump and his team have said. I do think that like we saw last time with the Trump administration, and frankly the Biden administration as well, they've gotten much smarter about how to put appointees in place early, especially for not those principal cabinet officials. You put them into the deputy slot, and then they become the acting agency head, and they're able to act in that position for quite a long time. We saw this in the Bureau of Land Management, part of the Department of Interior. The gentleman who ran that agency for over 3 years was in an acting position, and there were questions about the legality of actions that he and the agency took under that framework. But I don't think any conclusion came of them. And then the broader question, kind of like the nuclear question, which I saw somebody term in terms of recess appointments. I saw this described as using an atom bomb to kill an ant. By Daniel Schulman, who's an expert on Congress here in the US. And again, we will have to see. I think that will be tied in more broadly with the ability of the Senate to process nominations and the ability of the White House Presidential Personnel Office to get officials in place who are those appointees who don't require confirmation. It's really unclear. And then, I do think the last thing I'd say is budget will matter. We are currently in a continuing resolution budget situation here, which means that we're operating on last year's funding agreements, and Congress hasn't figured out the plan for the rest of fiscal year 2025, which goes through September 30th. And I bring that up now because the ability of agencies to bring in appointees is going to be dependent on the availability of money.
Yeah.
And so, I don't think that they're going to be able to bring in lots and lots and lots of political appointees without some clarity on the budget side.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason. And Richard, I am going to ask you later in our conversation about some of the specific appointments that the new president is making. But did you want to add anything on this issue of whether you think the process will be followed?
Just to get into the international perspective in the UK, and I'll touch on the UK kind of transition process in a moment, but we've just gone through a process where the government has changed. The civil service leadership doesn't change in the UK when there is a change of government, but we have seen the incoming Labour government make quite a lot of use of exceptions, as they're called, where they can hire senior civil servants, bring them into government for a short period of time to provide a focus on particular policy priorities that don't go through the normal recruitment processes. So that is to say, I think there is always a case for ministers and governments to be given flexibility to hire people who they trust and they think will be able to help drive their agenda. The difference, of course, being in the United States, there is already a large cadre of senior appointed officials that Jason mentioned. So I think then if you move from having those senior officials being in acting roles, then you're at risk of further adding uncertainty to that situation, which is, I think, what you would look at it from the outside, where there's other civil services that don't have the regular change of leadership upon an election.
Well, I do want to go on to our next kind of question, Jason. This does concern more the kind of civil servants, the permanent staff who are there. So in this period of transition, what will they be doing? So how will they be preparing for the incoming new president?
Yeah, absolutely. So in a couple different ways. So like I've said before, there's 2.1 million career civil servants in the US federal government. There's about 10,000 career senior executives who are kind of an interface between those political appointees who come and go and the remainder of the bureaucracy. And I bring up those two different groups because the senior leaders, the senior executives and others are going to be closer to the transition process. And that means they're going to be making sure, and again, some of this are processes that have been codified by Congress and put in place over time. So putting together information about their strategic plans, their staffing plans, identifying risk areas, identifying big procurements that are going to be on the horizon, kind of organizing information so that the incoming teams know what are some of the big rocks around here, what are some of the issues that you've been grappling with, and preparing that information so that when the actual appointees come in come January 20th, they kind of have a lay of the land. They have a roadmap that their transition officials are able to put in. Part of that the senior leaders in the workforce writ large are also doing is, reading the news or listening to speeches and seeing what's been said, both on the campaign trail and more recently, and trying to make sense of what is being said, what is of those things affects our program or our agency, and what might we therefore need to start planning for or thinking about. And I know that you had some examples about that I know are causing folks to kind of think about how this might affect their agency.
Yeah, thanks. And actually, we've got a couple of questions coming in on those in particular. But just before we get on to those questions, so Richard, I just want to ask you, everything Jason said now about the transition and civil servants, like the career civil servants, how does that compare with what would be going on in other countries?
Well, yeah, the example in the UK that I'll speak to, because we had an example, we had an election this year as well, is kind of quite a stark contrast. I think it's famously brutal, the aftermath of a UK general election, and swift. Yeah, after Rishi Sunak lost, he delivered a farewell speech outside the famous Black Door to 10 Downing Street, where the Prime Minister lives. And that was just after 12 hours after the polls closed. He resigned as Prime Minister before lunchtime the day after, and was replaced by Keir Starmer as Prime Minister before a full day had passed. That has its advantages, and I would say its disadvantages. It becomes very clear that a new government has been elected. The will of the voters is enacted at pace, but it also means that at a time when they're probably the most tired they've ever been in their lives, prime ministers and cabinet ministers are making extremely important decisions, being briefed on the most pressing problems that the country faces, and having to take decisions that might set the tone for, you know, as much as 5 years ahead. And this year, with the election being called at relatively short notice as well, the usual process where opposition parties are allowed what are called access talks in the UK civil service hadn't happened in all policy areas either, because the election was called about 6 months or so before it was necessary under UK law. So a lot of places, a lot of ministries were starting really from scratch when a new ministerial team arrived. And as I say, you know, that very much shows democracy in action when the cars are rolling to Buckingham Palace within 24 hours. But it also, I think it can kind of make force quick decisions on people at a time when they might not be best placed to take them.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I want to come back because we've got a couple of questions in, so I'm not going to move on just yet. I can't come back to this because I think a lot of people are very interested in the impact of this election on the career civil servants and in America and what they're going to be doing. So we've got two questions related to this. So Ahmed has asked, with the establishment of new departments and committees such as the Department for Government Efficiency, how will civil servants be preparing for these new departments, especially with plans for reducing the number of civil servants, and also perhaps the implementation of new technologies like AI, which will replace a lot of kind of the human work? And I also want to combine with that the first part of Jason Churchill's question, which was based on what's being said in the media about Trump's implementation plans for bureaucracy, what is likely to be the impact on public confidence in the American civil service? So Jason, could you just take that? So maybe you could just explain, for maybe some people who are listening don't know what President Trump has said about bureaucracy, and then would you like to cover off what do you think this means for the civil servants and how they're going to be preparing?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, President Trump has said he wants to go to war with the deep state. And by the deep state, he means the career bureaucracy. And so I can't say that that doesn't make people nervous. Your livelihood is being potentially attacked, frankly, for no good reason other than the job that you have, where you swear an oath to the Constitution to serve everybody equally and fairly in this country. You know, former President Trump did take action at the end of his administration to begin politicizing the civil service with creating a new personnel category called Schedule F, with the idea being that people in policy-related roles can be converted from civil service positions with due process protections into essentially political appointments that were at will. The former president's team said as many as 50,000 people could be subject to that rule. In reality, it could be several 100,000 based on interpretation. And I think that collectively, things like that have the civil service, folks within the civil service, nervous. But they have been through transitions before. These are professionals. And these individuals swear an oath to the Constitution and not to a president to serve everybody. And it will be hard. There will be uncertainty. But some of it is just part of the equation with how we have chosen to design these transition processes. Some things that have been promised or said won't actually happen, but some of them certainly will. And so I'm not gonna like sugarcoat that. And I think that the anxiety that people feel is potentially justified or likely justified based on that. And it's unclear, you know, is the problem with civil servants themselves, or is it bureaucracy, you know, rules, regulations, red tape? Uh, at the end of the day, these are things that policymakers, and I would argue these policymakers are our elected officials. It's their job to clean this stuff up. And they're going to need career civil servants who understand process, who understand how and why their agency is working this way. If they want to streamline and fix government and make sure that it's delivering for people in a smooth and seamless way. You know, you can't just throw it out the window and start over. And I'll tie in your Department of Government Efficiency question. This is a federal advisory committee that has been proposed by President-elect Trump that he wants to put Elon and Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy in charge of. It sounds like they're going to be looking to make recommendations around government efficiency, but like Congress is the only organization in town that can create a new government department. And so again, there are probably valid ideas, or at least discussion about how do we do government better, or how do we do government differently. The question is how thoughtful of a conversation will we be able to have, given the mandate that the incoming administration is claiming, and whether or not they might work with others to get after, like I said, we legitimately can do things to streamline the U.S. federal government. The question is whether they do things that negatively impact groups or communities or stakeholders. And so it's about those unintended or intended consequences. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, thank you. I should know that by now. Richard, did you want to add anything on this kind of, you know, the impact of some of the narrative on civil servants and how they're going to be preparing for some of these things like the efficiency kind of promises that have been made?
Well, I think we can come to the efficiency stuff in a bit, because I think there are some interesting international analogies to that. But just on the point about Schedule F, I think that is a thing that other countries have become aware of and will be watching to see the impact that has. As Jason said, you know.
Yeah, Jason, the second part of Jason's question, Richard, which maybe you're best placed to answer, is what do you think the likely impacts of what's being said about bureaucracy will have on the Americans' international reputation in some of these key policy areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think Schedule F will be a thing that people really watch, because as you mentioned in Siobhan, and the work the Global Government Forum has been doing on making government work, we were talking to civil service leaders, 12 cabinet secretary level officials around the world, about their priorities, and there is it was raised a number of times from the interviewees that you need to prove that government works. You need to prove that an impartial civil service exists for a good reason, and that it can deliver for governments of different colours. And you know, that's what these transitions from one government to another in any democracy are meant to prove. And I think, as Jason says, you know, US civil servants take a oath to the Constitution, and they will want to meet that responsibility. But the move to kind of Schedule F does kind of create, I think, a lot of personal uncertainty for people. And it is something that people will be watching around the world. If it goes ahead at the kind of scale that people are talking about, does it affect the quality of policymaking in the United States? Does it affect the quality of government delivery? And that will be very keenly watched, because if you believe in an impartial civil service, then you would believe that it might. And obviously you don't want that for individuals affected, but it's going to be a test case of a lot of arguments that are made, not often made from first principles anymore. They're kind of accepted, and it'll be interesting to see what happens if we strip them down to first principles.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Richard. It's great to have all these questions. Please do keep them coming in. I want to move on to, because we've talked a lot about the process. You mentioned about all of these appointments, Jason, that need to be approved during this period. So, Richard, and we've got questions coming in on this, so I don't want to duck these questions. So, Richard, could you give us a sense of some of the key appointments, the actual appointments that have already been made? So who are the people who President Trump has already chosen for some of these key appointments?
Yes, great, and I think that's probably the picture of the transition that's on that slide. Some of those appointments in that slide that we will get to. By my maths, when I did this yesterday, I think around 30 of the president's appointments have been named, and as we've kind of been mentioning, some of those will require Senate confirmation. I'd put them into 3 buckets: conventional picks that you could see Republican administrations making, more unconventional picks, and then the wild cards. I mean, I'm a keen watcher of American politics, but not a student of it. So, you know, feel free to argue with some of these definitions. But, you know, one of the first names that came out was Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. I would say that's a fairly conventional appointment. You could see different Republican administrations naming him to that post. I think it's fair to say Marco Rubio is a kind of foreign policy hawk, but I don't think he would have been out of place in previous Republican administrations. I would say broad strokes is the same is true of White House Chief of Staff Susie Wild, who has a fairly conventional background as a Republican political advisor. And then there's some of the more kind of unconventional picks. The appointment of Matt Gaetz, or nomination of Matt Gaetz as Attorney General, is one that has caused a lot of media furore. He's a self-described libertarian populist, and he's been under ethics investigations by the House of Representatives for sexual abuse allegations and drug use allegations, amongst other things. And when his nomination was announced, he stepped down from the House, meaning it's unclear if those investigations will continue, but that is an appointment that is meant to be approved by the Senate. Also in that unconventional bucket, I'd put Pete Hegseth, the Defense Secretary. He is a former National Guard officer, Army National Guard officer, who went on to become a TV presenter on Fox News, and he's written books on what you'd probably call culture war books on the attacks, as he would see it, on the military and society. So yeah, he's a culture warrior of the kind that I don't think is unusual for US politics at the moment, but even Republicans have raised that he's relatively inexperienced as a manager for that kind of role. And then there are, you know, what I think you might call the wild cards, the ones in that photo: Robert F. Kennedy and Elon Musk, probably chief amongst them. Again, as an observer of American politics, Kennedy has been on quite a remarkable political journey, from environmental lawyer and Democrat to anti-vaccine campaigner and independent presidential candidate, and now nominee for Health and Human Services cabinet position. I don't think he would have fitted into, say, a George W. Bush Republican administration, so it's a kind of different tenor of nominee. And I think probably Musk fits into the same sort of bracket. He has been named, as I'm sure everyone knows, I had seen on this call to head a Department of Government Efficiency, which is not actually a department of government, but it will be providing advice along with another a co-chair of that group, Vivek Ramaswamy, on how to, as they put it, dismantle government bureaucracy / regulations, cut wasteful spending. There's a lot of publicity around this initiative. I think President Trump called it the Manhattan Project of our time, which is going big at the start, referring to the initial Manhattan Project being to develop the first atomic bomb. So that gives you an idea of the ambition. And Musk said the department would send shockwaves through the system. So that's definitely, again, something that a lot of people will be keeping an eye on internationally. It's not formally part of government, but it will provide advice from outside government to the White House and to the Office of Management and Budget on how to drive large-scale structural reform and create an entrepreneurial approach to the work of government. He's not the first, Musk and Ramaswamy are not the first people from kind of outside government to do this kind of job. And when I was thinking about this last night, the example that came to mind was in the UK, one of the country's most successful businessmen at the time, called Sir Philip Green, was appointed to lead a government efficiency review in 2010. It was rather more prosaic. I don't think anyone referred to it as the Manhattan Project of its time, but the review found that government had consistently failed to make the most of its scale and buying power, and recommended a kind of centralized approach to buying goods and services and improving data on what government spends. Those are all worthwhile recommendations and did lead to some significant change in the UK government, particularly around the procurement reforms that have been implemented since. But I wonder if that matches with quite the expectations of what people are now expecting from the Department of Government Efficiency. If it could do some of those things, that would be a successful outcome, I think. But the expectations of a Manhattan Project for government are somewhat higher than that.
Well, we have, on that, Richard, we've got a question coming straight away from Alexander MacDonald, who has said, aimed at you, for you, Richard, said, if this works, if Trump and Musk succeed in streamlining government, reducing the size of the civil service and not damaging delivery, could you see this type of approach being replicated in the UK and elsewhere?
Oh, 100%. I mean, that's a big if, shall we say? But we've got a story on Global Government Forum today about the Japanese government, who have a Minister for Government Efficiency who has already said that they will take whatever recommendations come from the Department of Government Efficiency and apply them to the Japanese government. So if this can be done at scale, we often mention at Global Government Forum, the US federal government is a kind of order of magnitude bigger than anywhere else that we deal with. So any ideas that work in the US have a pretty good chance of working elsewhere, and there will definitely be real interest in even applying some of the more prosaic recommendations that might come out of it will get people's attention. And if the moonshot gets onto the moon, then I think, lots of people will be picking it.
Thanks, Richard. So, Jason, I'm going to come back to you. So I was going to ask you, and I still will, what these particular political appointments kind of indicate in terms of President Trump's approach and his kind of priorities. But I also want to pick up, because we've had a couple of questions in on the appointment. So Tammy Lewis has said, has history ever seen a leadership team who appears so unqualified for the roles they will assume? And if the impact of the leadership team is detrimental to the country, are there tools in place to handle the impacts. And Tammy's question is specifically concerned with the health portfolio. So I guess it comes back to, well, do you agree that this that they are uniquely unqualified, but also are there checks and balances in the system? Going back, I think, to what you said about maybe the approval for some of these appointments.
Yeah, I'm not going to make a value judgment on the nominees, but the president has the right and the authority to nominate whoever he wants, as long as they meet the extremely basic constitutional requirements, which I think are merely age. You know, you don't necessarily even have to be a citizen or be born here, you know, to be a high level government official. You just can't be the president. There are, as we talked about earlier, you know, process in place. You know, there's the Senate's advice and consent role. There is the practical reality, as we were just talking about, like service delivery is going to be key. And so if appointees are put into agencies and they are not delivering on their mission, there are going to be stakeholders who are super upset. And they're going to be upset either because it's affecting their industry or their community, or them as individuals. And, you know, for example, you see the healthcare industry rallying because they are concerned about some of the policies that RFK Jr. might put into place. But, you know, we do not have a king in America at this moment. That is not the system that we have designed. And so, you know, a lot of these things are proposals. You know, there is a process that has to be put into place. You know, agencies are going to have to commit dollars and put plans in place to operationalize ideas within their agencies. Within those agencies, they're going to be subject to oversight and scrutiny from inspectors general, from Congress's watchdog, the Government Accountability Office, if they are asked by members of Congress to do so, in the media and outside organizations. And so there are ways, you know, both within the government and outside the government, for checks and balances to occur. Does that mean that if there's agreement between the White House and an agency head and officials in Congress about the direction, that things may not head that way? Absolutely not. But elections have consequences.
Thanks, Jason. And you mentioned there in your answer, part of the process and the checks and balances is the inspector generals that you have in departments. And actually, we had a question come in advance from Nicole Drake, who said, Trump's campaign has pledged to make every inspector general's office independent and physically separated from departments. And Nicole was just saying, how do you think that might work in practice? I guess it's one of those we don't, you know, we need to wait and see. Any thoughts on that, Jason?
It's one of those that is easy to say but hard to operationalize, because the notion of independence is much more notional than it is real. You know, inspectors general are, especially for large departments, also Senate confirmed individuals nominated by the president. But their job is to they serve two functions, kind of like an auditor function in terms overseeing agencies, fraud, waste, and abuse. Are they following process and procedures that they say, and adopting and utilizing best practices? And then the other side is kind of a law enforcement, criminal and civil enforcement of penalties, laws, rules, and regulations that those agencies oversee. But, you know, the practical issue is, you know, say your inspector general office is co-located in an office building, or you are sharing information technology assets on the back end, like internet services or telecom or cybersecurity services. These are things where there's economies of scale that are at play, and where if you force those agencies to go out and build all that on their own, it's going to have to be paid for. And that might be an area where the reality of that idea kind of comes into fore. Will Congress want to fund that? Will they not? I don't know, but I think that that's kind of the practical. Okay, we've been told that the administration wants to do this. How do we actually do that? And those are the kinds of things that career civil servants will be hearing those ideas articulated, trying to think through that, and trying to put together some options to discuss with the transition folks in the time between now and January 20th. And then, the goal of those transition officials will be to try to form that up into a plan to leave for the new appointees who come in following January 20th, or to give them more information, to ask more questions, and really continue digging in.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason.
Nothing is as easy as it sounds.
No, there's kind of this tension, isn't there? It reminds me a bit of the Brexit period in the UK, where we similarly had a government who wanted to reduce civil service numbers and really push on efficiency, but because they were trying to see through Brexit, there was more and more stuff they wanted the civil service to do, and there's this kind of tension between, when you want to bring in a lot of change, you need the people to deliver that change, but equally you're trying to reduce numbers at the same time. So it does become very difficult. I am in a moment for the audience going to just tell you a little bit about Global Government Forum, because I'm conscious you might not know that much about what we do. So I will do that in a moment and give you a chance to send in kind of any final questions that you have. But I like this question from Penny, and I think I'll give it to you, Richard, first, and then to Jason. So Penny, going back to appointments, Penny Dunbabin has said, will the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard affect the willingness of countries such as the UK to share intelligence? I think this links with Jason's first question, Richard, around the impact of some of these appointments, in specifically this one on in the kind of security space. What impact do you think that might have on foreign relationships?
Yeah, just so in case the audience doesn't know, Tulsi Gabbard has been nominated as the director or potential director of national intelligence. I think it could. She's believed to be close to Russia, and has supported Syria in the ongoing civil war, Bashar al-Assad there. So she is an unconventional pick for that role, and if she was following her own, personal, or the policies that she has articulated, would be pursuing goals that conventional American allies might not agree with. So I think there is a risk that will happen, but history might be instructive here. I think similar risks were enunciated in Donald Trump's first term in the White House, and the security and intelligence sharing procedures that are long-standing between America and its closest allies, what called the Five Eyes, were resilient to that, and I think mainly remained operational. So it'll definitely cross people's mind. Let's put it that way. But I don't think we will kind of know immediately if the intelligence taps are turned off. The thing to remember, of course, is that the United States is the central spoke in this wheel. They can do without UK intelligence, most likely. We probably couldn't do without theirs. So that creates a kind of an incentive structure that probably keeps these things happening practically as much as anything else.
Jason, did you want to add anything on that point?
No, just I don't think so. I think Richard hit it well. I think it's the question of trust. Will allies and others be able to trust, especially that secrets, for example, are kept secret? And that's what I've read in the news, that there are concerns, about that potential individual. And again, we're going to have to see how that plays out.
Thanks. So I'm going to move on to kind of a bit about what GGF does, but please do send in any questions you've got now to Jason or Richard, whether you're a public servant yourself or whether you're a kind of partner, a private sector partner with government. Any comments, thoughts, questions you've got about kind of challenges and opportunities, I think, looking ahead to the new presidency. And Heidi, just to say, I'm not ignoring your comments. So you've done other comments about the deep state. It's just we're keeping this focus very much on what it means for government, I think, and for civil service and kind of federal employees in this particular conversation. But just for those of you who may not know very much about Global Government Forum, here is what we do. Next slide, Raquel, thanks. This is our mission. So we are focused on engagement and collaboration, which are designed to amplify your organization's reach and foster meaningful connections with public servants globally, regionally, or nationally. Next slide, please. We have a whole host of channels. So in addition to these kind of webinars, we run in real life kind of conferences, summits, round tables. We commission research on our own or with partners. We do a whole host of training events as well. We obviously have our website with great content on there. So we publish a lot of stuff that's relevant for civil servants all around the world. We run really good podcast series with civil service and public sector leaders, and also some private sector partners in there as well. Thanks, Raquel. Next slide. Why GGF? I think we're unique in terms of our global reach. I think we're the only probably organisation like this that has such a network of public servants around the world that we bring together in all these different ways. Our feedback shows we're very trusted and remain impartial on all of the work that we do. We'll send you all of these. So I'm just running through them very quickly because I'm conscious we have some new people with us in the audience. Next slide, please, Raquel. So there you can see our reach. We have lots of people across Europe who we are connected with. We have a largest audience, I think, as well in Canada and in the United States. But as you can see there, we cover all parts of the globe and we do events all around the world. So we have events in Singapore, in the Caribbean, across Europe, in Washington. And I'll be talking a little bit about another event that we're going to do in Washington in a moment. Next slide, please, Raquel. For those of you who are interested in particular, not just our public servants who are on the call, but the potential suppliers and the private sector partners that we work with, we will send you this one. This shows kind of who we are most connected with, including senior civil servants and the types of professions, very much across all professions in the public sector. But, you know, as you would expect, I think at the moment, a lot of people from the kind of digital data and technology side of things, because that's kind of underpinning a lot of the innovation that we're seeing across the public sector. Next slide, please, Raquel. So this one in particular might be of most interest to our audience today, because I'm conscious we will have a lot of Canadians and Americans in the webinar today. So we will be heading back to Washington. We were there this year for our inaugural event. We are coming back to Washington on the 13th and 14th of May next year for our event called Government Service Delivery. It's designed, I think, for all public service leaders and private sector partners who are interested in how technology can drive innovation and accelerate the delivery of government services. And regardless of the presidency, I don't think that's going to change. This is going to be something that's really, really a priority, whoever had won the election. So there will be an opportunity to hear from public sector leaders, not just from across the federal government, but we have fantastic speakers flying in from around the world as well. So really good opportunity if you can come to this one. Jason, would you like to come in? I see you'd raised your hand.
That was an accident, although I did.
Oh, no worries.
I did attend this event in DC this past year, and it's where I met you guys. I definitely recommend the folks who can come to put it on your calendar. It was a great event, a great opportunity to learn and chat with others who are working on this. And I agree that like service delivery and how technology drives progress there, that's going to continue being evergreen and something that there's a lot of interest in. So come on out and learn.
And another reason then you'll meet people like Jason in person at this event if you come along. Next slide, please, Raquel. I think this is more information. This is just some feedback. Jason saying how people really enjoyed our inaugural event. For a first event, fantastic. We had over 1,000 public servants who attended that event. So next slide, I think it's just the final one on Government DX. As I say, May 13th and 14th, it'll be in the Washington Convention Center. I know that's quite far away. So as I say, we will send you all of this so that you can have this in your inboxes. And then I think Raquel, have we got some thoughts on our webinars for next year? There are some of the up and coming webinars that we are planning. So a bit like today's conversation, we have experts who we will have a conversation with, but you as the audience can then help shape that conversation on all of our webinars. We've got webinars there lined up on cybersecurity, on digital credentials, on tackling fraud, on AI, which I know lots of public servants are already using, but also maybe have some concerns around. So, and also if you have ideas for a webinar, we always ask for input from our partners in the private sector, but also from our public service audience. If there are topics that you would like us to cover, please get in touch with us. The contact details are there. We would love to put on webinars that are of most interest to you. And then I think we just have something on training because we've got lots of questions coming in to get through. Again, we do lots of training. If you're a public servant or private sector and you would like to explore some training with us, please do get in touch. As you can see there, we run everything from digital services to leadership management and health and well-being. So a whole host of training opportunities for Global Government Forum. And then finally, I think is just our contact details, Raquel. And as I say, don't worry about screen grabbing that. We will send you all of those. So that was just very quickly a brief who we are in Global Government Forum. We look forward to working with as many of you as possible going forward, but it was also an opportunity just to get some more questions in, which is fantastic. So Natasha has said, Jason, I'm interested in your take on the new administration as it relates to the Centre for Disease Control and Prevention and Programs. That's quite a niche question. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that one, Jason.
Not specifically. I do know that, for example, stocks related to vaccines bottomed out with the nomination or the announcement of RFK Jr. coming in as potential HHS secretary. I don't think that we have heard names yet for individuals to lead the different components like the CDC or the National Institutes for Health. I think what I would say is that, the U.S. public health agencies have had bipartisan support for several decades now from both sides of the Congress. Now, I do think that the way that the government responded to the COVID pandemic and some policy choices that were made there affected trust with particularly with U.S. health agencies and health organizations writ large. I tie this to kind of what we were talking about earlier in terms of the information environment that we're working within. And, when it comes to issues like vaccines, it's not just people, it's kind of the left and the right edges kind of come together on that side of the curve to present more of a block of folks who have similar views. And that's an area where I think we're likely to see some change, but I think this is one where you're going to see a ton of activity and a big tug of war between various stakeholders and policymakers. The HHS secretary or agency heads have certain kind of broad plenary authorities based on laws that Congress has passed, but other things are going to require agreement on a way forward. And as I mentioned earlier, like the healthcare industry and the pharmaceutical industry, science industry in America are gearing up for these discussions. So I think that there's still more to come in terms of how this all plays out.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason. I think that's one of the overriding messages, isn't it? Is there's a lot that we don't know yet about how this is all going to kind of play out.
And people are picking and choosing what information they lead with. I would say if you are in a government agency, what kind of evidence do you have about program outcomes, about ROI, about ways you're making a difference, in communities and how you're delivering on your mission? At the end of the day, I think having kind of that actionable information, being able to answer those questions, okay. If you don't think something's working, or if you think we need to go somewhere else, be prepared to have those kinds of conversations. Because again, I don't think that the administration, and Republicans, given that they ran the tables, there's no one to blame if service delivery goes sideways for the next 2 years. And it will be interesting. These will be things that we'll be talking about.
Yeah, yeah. So Morris Bodnar, on that note of kind of what's going to happen over the next 4 years, has asked, Richard, I'm going to come to you first. To what degree do you think the introduction of AI and other new technologies will be used as a disruptive force in the renewal of the US civil services over the next 4 years?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Just before I get into that, I just want to say one of the webinars that we do have planned for next year is exactly as Jason was talking about, kind of looking at how the Department for Government Efficiency and other parts of the federal government can kind of evaluate the work of government and what's the most effective parts of it. So if there are people in our audience, public servants who are working in that kind of evaluation space, it would be great to hear their stories of how they make the case and can show the impact of the work that they do, because that is, I think, a crucial thing again for governments around the world to be able to show that impact. On artificial intelligence, I think there is a massive opportunity, and again, this is something that governments around the world are grappling with. The potential of the technology to kind of streamline how government works, to get rid of some of the more mundane tasks that public servants have to deal with, to free people up for more intensive or creative work is huge, but it also then requires the building blocks to be in place to unlock that, the data to be accessible, the right information to be collected, the hardware that government websites work on to be modern and allowing for the deployment of AI bots and things like that. I will scoop ourselves, if I can, just to highlight that later this week we will be publishing a report that Global Government Forum has compiled based on interviews with 13 members of the US federal government CIO Council on the key kind of building blocks that they could see, recommendations that the next federal government should take forward to accelerate digital transformation, both building on areas of progress that have happened so far and areas where there could be some kind of specific reforms to drive better use of technology in government, from kind of leadership and workforce to legislation and guidance. And I think the building blocks have to be there for AI. We've seen governments around the world struggle with digital transformation of government writ large. There's no kind of point replicating the struggles that some governments have had in the last 2 decades with the new technology, and it might require going back to re-examining how systems work. How if you had to come up with a government process and you could use artificial intelligence in it, how would you make that process run, as opposed to applying artificial intelligence to the process as it runs now, because that might not be the most efficient way to do it. That is a big job in any government, but we are seeing use cases developing in governments around the world, including in the US. But it'll be the work of kind of persistent people to scale it, I think. But I think we're kind of getting towards a roadmap, if not a kind of wide scale implementation yet. But the opportunity is massive.
Jason, did you want to add anything on AI?
Yeah, I think what Richard said is really spot on, and I think that we've been running forward without having the building blocks in place, frankly, and that kind of dynamic could be compounded with if the new administration comes in and imposes budget austerity, and budget austerity means lack of training dollars. And if we're not training our workforce on how to use these technologies, it'll be hard to make progress and to Richard's point, build, flesh out that capability around those building blocks and the capacity. You know, we also saw a hiring freeze within the first week of the last Trump administration, and then they imposed after that kind of an attrition-based hiring plan. We're not bringing in fresh talent who might be more experienced in their day-to-day life or in their work life with these technologies. Again, that digital acceleration and transformation could be curtailed. And I think the last thing I'd say is like there is going to be a need to understand the underlying processes, architecture, infrastructure, how we got here.
Yeah.
Because you can't just slap AI on the top of it and not deal with that. It just won't work. And that's the unglamorous work that it's unclear if, you know, Elon Musk is gonna think that folks should pay attention to.
Yeah.
And we have heard President-elect Trump say that they want to repeal the Biden administration's AI executive order. I personally haven't read the details of that, but I just don't know what that, you know, that feels like it has a big potential to kind of at least scramble the current approach that the government has been on, and insofar as it affects certain regulatory initiatives of the federal government, it also certainly has a business implication. So I do think technology policy, how it affects industry, but also policy internally, how it affects management processes and thinking are areas to look out for. It's going to be really interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting both in the US and here in the UK in our recent election, given how much technology is being used now to kind of try and boost efficiency and improve public services, how little it was talked about in the elections and how little it was part of anybody's pledges. But I guess that comes back to what the public's priorities were, but it will be interesting to see how that's taken forward. I'm just looking at the time and I can't believe how quickly that conversation has gone, but I think we are out of time. I just want to say, yeah, Ronette has just said, thank you so much. Very informative and thought-provoking. That's coming from Ronette, and I couldn't agree more.
Hi, Mom.
How much did you pay her, Jason? How much did you pay her? Thank you so much to Jason and to Richard. I mean, fantastic conversation there. Thanks to the audience for sending in so many brilliant questions. Really good conversation there. Just to say to the audience as well, we will have sent you a very short questionnaire. Going back to what I said, we always want to make sure we give you webinars on the topics that are of most use and interest to you. So please, if you could take a couple of minutes to send in, to fill in that questionnaire, I'd be hugely grateful. We will also be sending you a link of today's conversation with this video so you can watch it all again or share it with colleagues who weren't able to join us live today. And we will be writing an article covering the main issues that came out from today's conversation, and that will be shared with everybody who watched and everybody who registered. Jean has also said, thank you all so much for your time and for this information. You're doing such important work. That just leaves me to say again, thank you so much to Jason and to Richard. Really interesting conversation, so important, not just for America, not just for the federal staff there, but for the whole world. I think this is going to be really interesting and really important how the next 4 years pan out. Thanks to everybody, and I hope to see you on another one of our webinars very soon. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Richard. See you all. Cheers. Bye.